She was halfway down the aisle when her feet stopped moving. Not because she tripped. Not because her dress caught on anything. Beyoncé Adams simply stopped, like her body had finally decided to say what her mind had been too afraid to admit. The music kept playing. The guests kept smiling. But she stood there, frozen, in the middle of the most important walk of her life, and she could not take another step. The whole room noticed before they understood. A ripple of confusion passed through the pews, heads tilting, whispers rising. At the altar, Robert James stood with a wide, hopeful smile that slowly began to falter. Beyoncé's eyes swept the hall. Past the front rows packed with family. Past the middle rows full of friends and colleagues. Past the flowers and the candles and the carefully arranged perfection of a day that had taken 11 months to build. And then, the back row. Standing near the exit door, half hidden in the shadow of the doorframe, was a man who had not been invited. A man who never came to events like this. Johnny Young. Still. Watching. Present in the one moment she had told herself she would never let him near. The second her eyes found his, something inside Beyoncé Adams broke wide open. She raised her hand and pointed, and 300 people turned to look at the one man everyone feared. The morning of Beyoncé's wedding began the way she had always imagined it would. Her bridesmaids were loud and laughing. Her mother fussed over the veil with careful, trembling hands. Her cousin Kenya danced in the corner while doing her makeup, filling the hotel suite with music and the smell of hairspray, roses, and coffee. Everything was warm and full of life. But Beyoncé sat at the vanity mirror and stared at her own reflection, and she felt cold. She had been planning this wedding for 11 months. The flowers were cream and blush. The cake had 4 tiers. The venue, Hartwell Gardens, had been booked a full year in advance. Every detail was perfect. Every item on the checklist had been ticked. Robert James was a good man. Everyone said so. He had a stable job, a kind heart, and a family who adored Beyoncé. When he proposed, she had said yes without thinking twice. That was the problem. She had said yes without thinking. She had said yes because it was the right thing to do, not because every part of her screamed that he was the one. "You look absolutely stunning," her mother said, placing both hands on Beyoncé's bare shoulders. Her eyes were already watering. "I'm so proud of you, baby." Beyoncé smiled. She smiled because her mother needed her to. The alternative, telling the truth, would have broken her heart before the day even began. So Beyoncé swallowed the cold feeling down and smiled. Beyoncé first met Johnny Young 3 years before that wedding morning. She hadn't been looking for trouble. She was walking home from a late shift at the community center where she volunteered on Thursday evenings, cutting through Delmore Street the way she always did. That night, Delmore Street was not safe. 2 men stepped out of a dark alleyway and blocked her path. She remembered the smell of cigarettes, and the way one of them tilted his head like she was something that belonged to him. Her phone was in her bag. Her pepper spray was at home. She had nothing. Then a calm voice cut through the dark. "She's with me." Johnny Young was leaning against a black car, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the 2 men like they were minor inconveniences. He was Korean American, lean but solid, and the way he stood, like the entire block belonged to him, made the 2 men back away without a word. They disappeared into the dark. Just like that. Beyoncé stared at Johnny. He looked at her without a smile, without an introduction. He simply nodded once and said, "Don't use that shortcut again." Then he got in his car and drove away. She stood on that empty street for a long time afterward, wondering who he was and why her heart was still racing, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Beyoncé found out who Johnny Young was about a week later. She made the mistake of describing him to her coworker Denise. The black car, the quiet authority, the 2 men who disappeared without argument. Denise's face went pale immediately. "Beyoncé," she said slowly. "That's Johnny Young." The name meant nothing to Beyoncé at first. But Denise was from a part of the city where names like his meant everything. She leaned in and explained in a low voice that Johnny Young ran one of the most powerful underground operations in the city. Not a gang, exactly, something more organized, more dangerous, more untouchable. The kind of operation that police whispered about but could never seem to pin down. She said people who crossed him disappeared. She said entire businesses bent to his will. She said the stretch of blocks near the waterfront that had been cleaned up over the last few years, that hadn't happened because of any city program. It had happened because of Johnny. Beyoncé told herself she was terrified. She repeated it to herself several times that evening like a fact she needed to memorize. But what she kept returning to, lying in bed that night, was the sound of his voice on that dark street. Not threatening. Not cruel. Just steady, like someone who had decided long ago that fear was a waste of energy. That voice stayed with her in ways she was not yet ready to examine. Over the months that followed, Beyoncé told herself she had moved past that strange night on Delmore Street. She was busy with work, with family, with the slow and steady relationship she was building with Robert. Robert, who brought her soup when she was sick. Robert, who remembered her mother's birthday. Robert, who made every reasonable choice that a reasonable man could make. But Johnny Young kept appearing. Not in a frightening way. Not like a threat. More like the city kept placing him in her path. She would catch a glimpse of him across the street outside a restaurant she was eating at. He would be speaking quietly on a phone near the community center when she left late at night. Once, she came out of a parking garage to find a flat tire on her car, and a man she had never seen before was already fixing it. When she asked who sent him, the man said nothing and drove away in a black car that looked exactly like the one from Delmore Street. Beyoncé never confronted Johnny about it. Part of her was afraid of what he might say. The other part, the part she feared most, was afraid of what she might feel when he said it. Because every time she caught a glimpse of him, something shifted in her chest. Something quiet and stubborn and impossible to name. So she kept walking forward with her life and tried to pretend the feeling was not there. The first time Beyoncé and Johnny actually spoke, really spoke, was 5 months after Delmore Street. She had stayed late at the community center finishing a grant report, and when she finally stepped outside, the parking lot was completely empty. That was when she saw him sitting on the side steps, alone, like he had been waiting for some time. Her heart jumped. She stopped walking. He looked up. "You work too late," he said. "You shouldn't be here," she answered. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. There was a small softening at the corner of his mouth that she noticed and filed away somewhere private. He stood slowly and adjusted his jacket, and in the yellow glow of the parking lot light, he looked less like a dangerous man and more like a tired one. "The grant," he said. "For the after-school program. They're going to approve it." She blinked. "How would you know that?" He said nothing. He simply looked at her with those steady, unreadable eyes. And she understood in a rush that the reason the grant was going to be approved was because of him. Because someone who feared his name had made a phone call. Because his influence reached into rooms no one would ever admit he had entered. She should have been angry. She should have told him she didn't want his help. Instead she said quietly, "Thank you." He nodded once, like that was enough, and walked away into the dark. Robert proposed on a Tuesday evening at a rooftop restaurant he had rented out entirely. There were fairy lights strung across the ceiling and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. His hands were shaking when he got down on one knee. The ring was beautiful, a round solitaire on a thin gold band, chosen with enormous care. Every detail of that rooftop was a memory he had built for the two of them. Photos of their first date, their road trip to the coast, the hiking weekend where they got lost and laughed about it for an hour. He had thought of everything. "Beyoncé Adams," he said, voice catching. "Will you marry me?" She said yes. She meant it, or she thought she did. Standing there in the fairy lights with the city spread below and Robert's hopeful face looking up at her, saying yes felt like the most natural thing in the world. He was everything a person was supposed to want. He was consistent and warm, and he loved her in all the ways that were easy to see. What she did not allow herself to think about, not even for a second, was Johnny Young. She did not allow herself to think about the way something shifted in her every time he was near. She chose, in that moment, to want the life that made sense. She slipped the ring onto her finger and smiled with everything she had. She almost believed it was enough. 2 months after the engagement, something happened that changed everything. Beyoncé's younger brother Marcus got into serious trouble. He owed money, a lot of it, to people who did not accept payment plans. She didn't know the full story until he showed up at her apartment at midnight shaking, with a bruise spreading across his jaw and terror in his eyes. He told her the men were coming back. He had 3 days. She held him on her couch and promised it would be okay, even though she had no idea how to make that true. Robert listened patiently when she called him. His advice was measured and careful: call the police, file a report, look into legal options. Sensible. Not fast enough. Beyoncé spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling. And then, without fully deciding to, she went to find Johnny Young. It took her 2 days to locate someone who could carry a message to him. She left no details, just her name, and that she needed to speak with him. That same evening, a car pulled up outside her apartment, and a man she had never seen held the back door open. She got in. Johnny was already inside, sitting in the far corner of the back seat, watching her with an expression that gave away nothing. "Tell me," he said simply. And she told him everything about Marcus. Johnny listened to every word without interrupting. That alone was unusual. Most people, when given difficult information, jumped in with solutions or reassurances or their own experiences. Johnny simply listened. He kept his eyes on Beyoncé the entire time, and did not flinch at a single detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The car moved slowly through night traffic, either of them speaking. "Marcus will be fine by tomorrow morning," he said finally. "What does that mean?" she asked. He turned to look out the window. "It means the people he owes money to will discover they have more pressing concerns than your brother." She didn't ask how. She understood enough by then to know that Johnny didn't answer questions that way. What she understood was that the threat to Marcus would be removed, not because it was legal or simple, but because Johnny Young had decided it would be. The next morning, Marcus called. His voice was steady for the first time in weeks. He said the men had reached out to say the debt was cleared. He didn't know why. He didn't ask why. He was just grateful and confused and deeply relieved. Beyoncé sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold and thought about what Johnny had done. Not for payment. Not because she had offered him anything. He had done it because she asked, because she needed him. That realization sat in her chest like a burning coal for a very long time. Beyoncé went to thank him. She tracked down the same contact, left the same message, and the same car arrived. This time, Johnny met her at a quiet restaurant near the water. The kind of place with low lighting and no music, where conversations could happen without being heard. He was already seated when she arrived, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking unexpectedly human. She sat across from him and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, careful and complicated, something he had been holding back. Then he said, "Because you asked? And because you're someone who deserves to not carry everything alone." The words hit Beyoncé harder than she expected. She had been carrying things her whole life. Her mother's expectations. Her brother's chaos. Her own doubts about the future. Nobody had ever named it so plainly. Nobody had looked at her and simply seen the weight. She didn't reply immediately. She looked down at her hands and noticed her engagement ring catching the light. When she looked up, Johnny was looking at it too. His expression didn't change. But something in the air between them shifted, the way a room shifts when a window is suddenly opened. They sat together for 2 more hours that night. They talked about small things. Simple things. And it was the best conversation Beyoncé had had in months. The engagement moved forward. 11 months of milestones ticked off like duties being fulfilled. Venue booked. Invitation sent. Dress fitted 3 times. Robert was happy. Beyoncé's mother was thrilled. Her friends threw a bridal shower with a pink cake and embarrassing games, and she laughed at all the right moments. But somewhere inside her, a quiet war was being fought. She saw Johnny twice more during those months. Both times were brief and practical, once because she needed guidance about a safety issue at the community center, and once when he appeared beside her broken-down car on a rainy Thursday and arranged a tow without being asked. Each time she saw him, the feeling grew harder to deny. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly present, steady and persistent like a low hum beneath everything. It was something deeper. A recognition. Like finding a word in a foreign language that perfectly describes something you have felt your whole life but could never quite say. She told herself it was a fantasy. She told herself that Johnny Young existed in a world that could only bring danger, and that Robert's world was the one that made sense. She repeated these things in the mirror every morning. She told herself these things every time she touched the ring on her finger. She almost believed them. Almost, but not quite. 1 week before the wedding, Johnny called Beyoncé directly. She didn't know he had her number, but of course he did. She sat in her car in a parking lot and stared at his name on the screen for 4 full rings before answering. "There's something you should know," he said. No greeting. No small talk. She gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" He told her about a man named Vincent Hale, someone connected to the same underground circles Johnny operated in, who had been watching Beyoncé's family. Not because of anything she had done, but because Johnny had made enemies over the years, and those enemies had noticed that he had what he called a soft spot. Vincent Hale intended to use it. "The soft spot is me," Beyoncé said. It wasn't a question. Johnny paused. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. The man everyone feared, the man whose name made other dangerous men back down, had a soft spot. And it was her. The community center volunteer. The bride-to-be. The woman who still hadn't fully admitted to herself what she felt. "Are Marcus and my mother safe?" she asked. "I've made sure of it," he said. "And me?" A longer pause. "I'll always make sure of you, Beyoncé," he said softly. The line went quiet. She sat in that parking lot until the sky turned dark, holding her phone and breathing slowly. The night before the wedding, Beyoncé could not sleep. She lay in the hotel room on her side of the floor, tradition, her mother had insisted, and stared at the ceiling while the clock moved from midnight to 1 to 2 to 3. She kept thinking about what Johnny had said. "I'll always make sure of you." Not, "I'll keep you safe." Those were words people said without thinking. He had said he would always make sure of her. Like the commitment was already made and had been for some time. She thought about Robert. Good, kind Robert, asleep 50 feet away because he had no doubts. He loved her clearly and simply, the way a person loves someone they have already decided on. She didn't question his love. She only questioned whether she could give him back what he deserved. She thought about standing at the altar and speaking the vows. "I do. In sickness and in health. Till death do us part." She tried to picture herself meaning every word, completely, with her whole heart, and something inside her flinched. At 4 in the morning, she finally got up and sat by the window. The city was quiet below. Somewhere out there, Johnny Young was awake too. She knew it the way a person knows certain things, not from evidence, but from the deep, wordless place where the truth lives before you are brave enough to say it out loud. The wedding morning moved like a dream. Beyoncé's mother pinned her veil with careful hands and declared her the most beautiful bride she had ever seen. Kenya danced to a song in the corner. The photographer kept asking her to turn toward the window. Everyone around her buzzed with joy. Beyoncé moved through it all like a woman sealed inside glass, present but distant. Smiling but hollow. She responded to every laugh, every toast, every teary hug, and behind all of it, a question beat quietly against the inside of her chest. Is this right? Not, is Robert a good man? He was. Not, is this a good life? It could be. The question was simpler and harder than either of those. Is this true? When she stood at that altar and made those promises, would every word be the whole truth? Or would she be building her marriage on a version of herself that she had carefully edited? The version that looked right. The version that fit the story everyone expected. She picked up her bouquet when her mother handed it to her. White peonies and trailing greenery. Heavy in her hands. She looked at herself one final time in the full-length mirror. White dress. Perfect hair. Shaking hands hidden inside cream-colored gloves. Ready? Her mother asked. Beyoncé looked at her own eyes in the reflection. Something in them was asking the same question. Something in them already knew the answer. She took a long, slow breath and said, "Let's go." Hartwell Gardens was breathtaking. 300 guests filled the rows of white chairs. The late afternoon light fell through tall arched windows and long golden slants. Flowers covered the pillars, lined the aisle, and wove through the ends of every row. String musicians played something soft and sweeping near the front. The hall smelled of candles and fresh lilies. Beyoncé waited at the back with her father, who had flown in from Atlanta and had not stopped smiling since he landed. He kept squeezing her hand. "This is the happiest day," he whispered. "The absolute happiest." She looked down the long white aisle toward the altar where Robert stood. He wore a charcoal suit with a cream boutonniere. His best man leaned over to whisper something, and Robert laughed, a real, easy laugh. He looked handsome and calm and genuinely, deeply happy. The music changed. The processional began. Beyoncé's bridesmaids walked, one by one, and then it was her turn. Her father offered his arm. She took it. The doors opened fully and 300 people turned to look at her. She started walking. Step by step down the white runner. Her father beside her. The music swelling. Robert's face ahead of her, breaking into that wide, warm smile. She told her feet to keep moving. She told her heart to be still. She told herself this was the right thing, the good thing, the thing she had chosen. For about 40 steps, she almost believed it. Nobody could have said exactly which step it was when everything changed. Maybe step 41. Maybe 45. But somewhere in the middle of that aisle, with 30 feet of white runner still ahead and the altar in clear sight, something rose up from deep inside Beyoncé Adams, something she had no way to fight. It wasn't panic. It was clarity. Like a light being switched on in a room that had been dark for too long. Everything suddenly sharp and honest and impossible to ignore. It said in a voice that was entirely her own, "You cannot do this. Not because Robert is wrong. Not because this life is wrong. But because the truest version of you has been standing in parking lots and quiet restaurants and cars in the dark, and she has been trying to tell you something for 3 years." Her feet stopped. Not gradually. They simply stopped, as if the signal between her mind and her body had finally, mercifully, been cut. Her father felt it immediately. His arm stiffened. "Beyoncé?" he murmured, low and careful. The music kept playing. The guests were still smiling, not yet understanding that something had changed. Robert continued watching her from the altar with that open, hopeful expression. She stood absolutely still in the middle of the aisle and breathed. One breath. Then another. And then she did what her eyes had been wanting to do since she walked through those doors. She swept the room. Her eyes moved across the rows slowly, the way a person searches for something they're not sure they'll find but need to look for anyway. Past the front rows where families sat in their finest clothes. Past the middle rows filled with colleagues and friends. Past the faces she knew and the ones she barely recognized. And then, the back row. He was standing, not sitting, which was why she found him. Everyone else was seated. But Johnny Young stood near the last row, back against the wall beside the exit door, shoulders straight, dark jacket, hands at his sides. Like he had arrived quietly and planned to leave the same way. Like he had come only to see, not to interrupt, not to stop anything. Just to see. Their eyes met. 300 people in that room. The music still playing. Her father still holding her arm. And the world narrowed to a single point. Johnny. The steadiness in his eyes. The way he stood like nothing in the room surprised him, except, perhaps, how quickly she had found him. Like he had not expected her to look. Beyoncé's arm dropped from her father's. The bouquet loosened in her fingers. And then, without planning it, without thinking it through, she raised her hand and pointed directly at him. At Johnny Young. At the man in the back row. At the one man no one had invited, and the one man that everyone in that hall would fear if they knew his name. The music stopped. 300 people turned at once. The sound was like a wave, the rustle of fabric, the creak of chairs, the collective inhale of a crowd that has just realized something extraordinary is happening. The musicians stopped mid-note. The officiant stepped forward, confused. Beyoncé's mother's voice rose from the third row, sharp, frightened, and full of love. Robert's face fell apart slowly, the way a careful structure falls when one support is removed. His smile faded. His brow creased. He looked from Beyoncé to the back of the room and back again, searching for the explanation that would make this make sense. Her father placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said, very low and very careful. "What are you doing?" She couldn't answer him. Not yet. She didn't have the words. All she had was the raised hand, the burning certainty, and the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. In the back row, Johnny Young had gone very still. He was no longer leaning against the wall. He stood fully upright, eyes locked on Beyoncé, face unreadable to everyone in the room, except her. Because she had learned, over 3 years, what Johnny looked like when he was holding something back. The small tension at the jaw. The change in his breathing. He was not calm. He was deciding, in this exact moment, what to do. He started walking. The murmuring in the room built like a gathering storm. Fragments floated through the air. "Who is that? Does anyone know him? What is happening? Oh my God!" threaded between the sound of Johnny's footsteps as he moved down the side aisle. He walked the way he always walked. Slow. Deliberate. Without hurry. As though the whispers and stares were weather passing through, not something that could reach him. Robert stepped away from the altar. "Who is this?" He kept his voice controlled, but the hurt underneath it was audible. Clean, honest hurt. "Robert," Beyoncé said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I am so sorry. Beyoncé." His voice cracked on her name. "I'm sorry," she said again. "You deserve someone whose whole heart is present. Mine has not been." She held his gaze fully, with all the honesty she had been carrying for 11 months. "That is my failure. Not yours. You are a good man. And I cannot stand at that altar knowing what I know." Robert stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Johnny, who had stopped a few feet away. The two men looked at each other across the white flowers and the candlelight. Then Robert looked back at Beyoncé and nodded once, a small, dignified nod. "Okay," he said quietly. He stepped back. He gave her the most graceful exit she had never deserved. Johnny stopped 2 feet in front of her. This close, Beyoncé could see the details that crowds and distance usually swallowed, the steadiness in his dark eyes, the faint tiredness underneath, the way he was watching her like he was measuring every possible outcome of this moment. "You came," she said. "I heard you were making a mistake," he said simply. "How did you hear that?" "I've been paying attention for 3 years." The words fell into the space between them and settled there. 3 years. Since Delmore Street. Since the flat tire and the Grant and the parking lot phone call and the quiet restaurant by the water and every moment in between. 3 years of watching, protecting, staying at the edges of her life because she was building something else. 3 years of making sure she was safe and never once asking for anything in return. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Because you were building a life," he said. "And I wasn't going to pull you away from something good for something complicated. It was never that simple," she told him. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." Behind her, she could hear her mother somewhere between crying and fury. She could feel 300 people watching every breath they took. but the world had shrunk to the 2 feet of space between them, and everything outside it was just background noise. "Johnny," Beyoncé said, her voice raw and quiet and completely honest, "you have been keeping me safe since the night we met. You fixed things I didn't even know were broken. You helped Marcus when I had nowhere to turn. You made sure Vincent Hale couldn't get to my family. You did all of that without ever asking me for a single thing." He didn't deny it. He simply watched her. "I need to know why," she said. He exhaled slowly. Something in his expression loosened, the way a door opens after a long time of being locked. He reached out and very carefully took her gloved hand in both of his. He didn't hold it tightly. He held it like it was something worth being gentle with. "Because from the first night I saw you," he said, "standing on that street in the dark, looking at me like I was a puzzle you intended to solve, I knew. I've spent the last 3 years making sure nothing takes you away from the world before you figure out what you actually want." The murmur in the room had gone quiet again. Even Beyoncé's mother had stopped crying. 300 people stood suspended in the moment, caught in something none of them had expected to witness today. A confession in the middle of a wedding hall, under the light of still burning candles, with white flowers on every surface. Beyoncé squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The room erupted. Not into violence or screaming, into noise. Confused, layered, overlapping noise. Beyoncé's aunt stood up and demanded to know what was happening. Her father positioned himself beside her with his hand on her shoulder, not pulling her away, just being there, solid and present. Kenya, from somewhere in the middle rows, said loudly, "I knew it," which made no sense and somehow made perfect sense. Robert's mother had her hands over her mouth. Robert himself had sat down in a front row chair and was staring at his own shoes. Beyoncé's heart broke a little for him all over again, not with love, but with genuine, aching guilt for the pain she had caused someone who had never done anything except care for her. Johnny stood beside her, still holding her hand, and he did not look at the crowd. He looked only at her. 300 people making noise around him might as well have been a light breeze. "Are you sure?" he asked, quietly, meant only for her. "I have never been more sure of anything," she told him. "My world is complicated," he said. It wasn't a warning away. It was the full truth, offered so her choice could be made with open eyes. Because that was who Johnny was. He never softened things to make them easier to swallow. "I know your world," she said. "I've been standing at the edge of it for 3 years." He held her gaze for one more long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Really smiled. And it was worth every moment of doubt. Beyoncé's mother reached her before anyone else. She shouldered through the standing, confused guests, and stopped directly in front of Johnny and Beyoncé with blazing eyes and hands on her hips. She was a small woman. She had never once seemed small. "Who?" she said, looking directly at Johnny. "Are you?" To his credit, Johnny met her gaze without flinching. "My name is Johnny Young," he said. "And what is your business with my daughter?" A pause. Then, "That depends on your daughter." Her mother looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she turned to Beyoncé, at her face, her eyes, the way she was standing. Mothers have a way of reading their children that goes beyond words. She had been reading Beyoncé her whole life. And something moved through her expression, fear, anger, confusion, before landing somewhere surprising. She turned back to Johnny. "Are you going to keep her safe?" "Yes," he said. No hesitation. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the blazing look had softened slightly. "Robert was a good man," she said. "He was," Beyoncé agreed. "He still is. You really couldn't go through with it." It wasn't a question. She had seen something in Beyoncé's face all morning and chosen not to name it. "No, Mama," Beyoncé said softly. "I couldn't." Her mother pulled her into a fierce, long hug. When she finally let go and wiped her eyes, she looked at Johnny and said firmly, "You had better mean what you say." "I do," he said simply. Beyoncé's father was harder. He took her aside. out into the side hall, away from the crowd, and sat them both down on a bench near the window. He was quiet for a long time. He was a man who chose his words carefully, which meant the silence before he spoke was always heavy with meaning. "Tell me about him," he said finally. So she did. She told her father everything. From Delmore Street to Marcus, to the phone calls, to the things Johnny had done quietly, and from a distance that she had only half understood at the time. She told him about 3 years of watching over her that she had only fully pieced together in recent months. She told him about the restaurant by the water and the conversation that lasted 2 hours, and the way something inside her had refused, ever since, to fully close. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet again for a moment. "He's a dangerous man," her father said. "I know. The life he leads puts you at risk. I know that too." He looked out the window at the afternoon light. "Does he love you?" Beyoncé thought about every silent choice Johnny had ever made. Every protected moment. Every careful, unasked-for gesture over 3 long years. "Yes," she said. "I think he's been loving me in the only way he knew how." Her father nodded slowly. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "Bring him to dinner next Sunday." He walked back through the door, and Beyoncé sat alone on that bench for a moment, quietly smiling. Before the day was over, Beyoncé found Robert alone in the garden outside the hall. He was sitting on a stone bench beside a row of rose bushes, jacket off, hands loosely folded, looking at the evening sky. He looked up when he heard her approach, and his expression was quiet, sad, and composed in the way of someone who had been working through something hard and was coming out the other side. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting beside him. "Truly, Robert. You deserved none of this." "No," he said. "I didn't." He said it without bitterness. Just honesty. "But I'd rather know now than later. I should have been honest sooner. With you and with myself." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew something was off," he said finally. "I think I've known for a while. I kept hoping it would change." He glanced at her sideways. "I need you to know that I think you're one of the best people I've ever met, Beyoncé. Today doesn't change that." His kindness in that moment was harder to receive than anger would have been. Anger would have been easier to carry. His grace put the weight of the guilt exactly where it belonged, squarely and fairly on her. "I hope you find someone incredible," she said. He smiled, small and genuine. "I will." He stood, picked up his jacket, and extended a hand. She shook it. Then he laughed quietly, shook his head, and said, "Of all the ways I expected today to go." He walked back inside, and Beyoncé sat in the garden a while longer, letting the quiet settle. By the time the last guest had gone and Hartwell Gardens had fallen quiet, the sky outside had turned a deep, soft purple. The caterers were packing up. The flowers would be donated to the hospital in the morning. That had been arranged months ago, and nobody had thought to change it. Somewhere in the hall, the 4-tiered cake still stood on its table, untouched and perfect. Johnny found Beyoncé standing at the far end of the main room, looking out through the arched windows at the evening light. He came to stand beside her without a word, the way he had always done, present, quiet, taking up exactly the space he needed and no more. "What happens now?" she asked. "No," he said. "You decide what you want your life to look like. And whatever you decide, I'll be beside it." "Not beside it," she said. "Beside me." He looked at her. "Beside you," he agreed. She turned to face him fully. The room was almost empty. The candles had burned down to their last flicker. The white flowers on the pillars had begun to droop at their edges. And Johnny Young, the man everyone feared, the man who had spent 3 quiet years making sure she was safe, the man who had walked down that aisle while 300 people stared and had not slowed down for a single step, looked at her the way she had always wanted to be looked at. Like she was someone worth walking toward. Beyoncé stepped forward. He didn't move back. And in the last golden light of that impossible evening, she finally stopped running from the truest thing she had ever felt, and she let it in.